There we go.
And now we're ready.
Now we are. Thank you very much for joining us. Sorry for those little technical difficulties. First time we ran into that one. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm. We're pleased to have you joining us for this Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented in conjunction with our good friends at RenWeb. Today we're going to be discussing It Will Never Happen Here, how to conduct a self-assessment. We invite you to become our friend at Facebook, Firestorm Solutions on Facebook, and Firestorm Soul on Twitter. There is a hashtag for this section, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that this presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product should be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. We're delighted to have RenWeb as our host and co-sponsor of this Crisis Coach webinar series. This is April, and so it's the fourth in the 2015 series. You can go to firestorm.com where you can register and watch previous webinars in this series, and you can register for future webinars. Shannon, I believe you're on mute. If you could join us, and if you would like to make some comments about the wonderful RenWeb organization.
Sounds like that button must not be working for Shannon. Shannon, if the mute comes off and you can comment, feel free to do so at any time. I'll just jump in, Bill.
Okay.
We'd like to thank everybody that is a RenWeb user, and the system does provide you a great many capabilities to be used before, during, and after a crisis, and we'll be expanding those activities and discussions in the coming months and as we move forward. I would also remind everyone that is a RenWeb user, there is a user conference coming up this summer in San Antonio, and it is a great opportunity to network with your peers from other schools to learn more about the system and how it works, and we'll be doing a Crisis Coach series of workshops. It'll be a little mini boot camp around crisis management for you at that conference, and it's certainly included in the registration, and we would encourage you to come and be a part of it. We met many of you at the user conference last year in Atlanta and the one the year before in Dallas, so San Antonio is a great place, and I think you'll enjoy that opportunity as you do. My name is Jim Satterfield. I am your presenter today as we talk about this subject. And as you think about it, can you identify your school's next crisis? What's the crisis that's facing your organization? Is it a natural disaster or an event? I know we've been having the ground move in Texas a little bit recently with some little minor quakes. We've certainly had winter storms. There's tornado warnings today around the country in a variety of different areas. The armed intruder, the shooter at a school is certainly a concern. There are business crises in schools around financial issues and concerns. Can you identify your next crisis? And I'd like you to think about that as we go through the workshop today, as we talk about these particular areas. You want to be able to say, yes, we can, and we have plans in place to deal with it as we go forward. Today, I challenge you to think about yourself and your job at the school in a different hat. We're going to make you today an internal auditor. Now, I know internal audit is a term that we normally use to refer to businesses and involvement, and large corporations have entire departments that conduct internal audit procedures. And it's not just accounting functions, it's are our business processes in place? Do we have the right things for quality in our organization? Are there the right types of issues happening, and is what we think happening actually occurring? But that same role needs to be played within our schools, and you're the person within your school that should be the lead in that. That should be an area for you to focus on. Every parent is focused on the question of, is my child safe? Are you sure my child is safe? How do you know my child is safe? And so as we look at our plans and we audit what we're trying to do in our schools for preparedness and safety and security, that we need to make sure that we can assure our board and our senior leadership that we have everything in place. Now, whether you have a head of school or a principal or a director, whatever you call that title, they certainly have the pressure and feel the responsibilities in that direction. But your board, whether it's a board of directors or a board of trustees or an advisory board, has a governance and fiduciary responsibility to make sure that all of these elements are in place. And as you think about it, I'm going to challenge you today in our webinar to start to look at how you can address those issues to make sure it's not going to happen in your school as you go forward. We're going to look at the risk management processes that you have. You want to make sure that the risks that you have are correctly evaluated, and for those key risks, those highly likely or the high potential impact risks, that you've evaluated them correctly and that there's clear reporting on those activities, that there's a review process of how you control those risks and come together, that you have a system that you can manage that, and that you do the monitoring of those elements associated with it. Now, monitoring is extremely important. In fact, the third largest failure in a disaster or crisis is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. Having a formal monitoring program, having your own intelligence network, as we've talked about in this webinar series, is a great example of how that would work. So just as you would monitor the weather, monitoring what's going on and what the people in your school are talking about, what's going on in our school community. And we're finding that these conversations are occurring on social media. One good thing about this intelligence aspect as we think on it is that 80% of the time, if someone has a problem, someone that has ill intent toward the school, they're thinking about bringing a gun, or they're committing bullying, or there's sexual harassment, or they're contemplating suicide, someone else knows 80% of the time. 67% of the time, 2 or more people know. And when people know, they talk, and today they talk on social media. So having a formalized program to listen for that would certainly make a difference as we come together. So what I would like to do is to have us think about why we want to measure where our plans are. Why are we looking to do this? Can your school survive a disruption or a crisis? Many times we see people becoming labeled with the events that go on around them, whether it's Columbine, which you don't think of as the state flower of Colorado, but the school where the shooting was. If I say Sandy Hook, your mind immediately goes to that same area. But it could be anything that would start to define, and the survivability of your school is critical in these particular areas. So where does your school stand today? What does your program need to do to improve? What do you need to look to start to bring yourself in line with best practices? Are you making progress toward doing that? What are your priorities? What are the gaps? Are our suppliers prepared? Or even, do our teachers have plans at home so that they know their family is safe, and therefore if there was an area event, they're still free to support the school and what you're trying to accomplish? Because family trumps job, and making sure those elements are all in place. These are just some of the reasons on why we would measure. But if you think about why measuring it, it's if we got ready to take a trip, and I guess maps that used to fold up and keep in your car are almost becoming a thing of the past with GPS systems, but the same concept is there. You've got a starting point. You've got a destination that you're going to. You want to measure the distance. How far do we have to go? What is the best routes? What are the alternatives that we can do? And how do we measure progress? Now, it's easy with our GPS in our car or on our phone to be able to lay out that trip. But in looking at your plans today, where are the plans today? Where should they need to be? That's best practices. And how do we get there? In some cases, we may have to do a workaround. Maybe we don't have the ability to lock our classrooms, by the way, from the inside. By the way, that's the national standard. That's best practices. Classrooms should be locked during the school day. Again, we're trying to extend the time frame that you have so that first responders can make it to your location if you need to. But those are all reasons to measure and to understand your plans. Well, what is it that you should measure? Well, you've got to focus first on what your goals are with your program. We were working with a group in New Jersey that is a manufacturer, and they want to know that their plans align with OSHA standards and environmental health and safety, and they wanted training on those. But the key is it's not training on the standards, it's training on your plan, and the training that you do within your school has to be the same way. So you've really got to understand what the goals are, and that means having an overarching framework document to say this is how we're structured from a preparedness standpoint in our school. We operate under an administrator on duty strategy so that we have a cell phone, and that administrator on duty carries it. So if I'm the administrator today and you are tomorrow, we pass the phone from me to you. The advantage of that is there's just one number for everyone to know who to call and how to operate. If you've got multiple buildings on your campus, or you've got different schools with a lower school and a middle and an upper, you may need to have multiple people that play some of these roles. Again, a function of size. If you're a medium-sized school with several hundred students, probably a single administrator on duty. But knowing how your program is set up is involved in the framework. Who is your crisis management team? Who's directing the incident response? How do we deal with behaviors of concern? How do we deal with communicable illness? All of those elements would carry that forward. So how do you demonstrate preparedness? By testing your plans. Much rather see a test than have to implement it. That means you've got a crisis and an issue that you're dealing with. And so that's an area that you want to be able to demonstrate that your plans actually work, that there are clear roles, that there are defined responsibilities. And you want to be able to show specifically how your standards align to best practices. And we're going to give you some tools today and a structure for you to implement in your school to be able to address those particular issues. And as you think about these plans, you need to know that it needs to tell you what to do, but more importantly, it needs to tell you how to do it. That's what makes your plan actionable. One of the biggest failures we find when we review a plan for school is there's a lot of whats and virtually no hows. And so a test here, if you want to do, and that goes back up to the testing role about how you can demonstrate it, take your plan and give it to your newest teacher and then have them tell you, how does this plan tell you how to do these things? And if they can't figure it out from that plan, that means that plan isn't sufficient. There's a weakness there, because it's not the fact that you've been at the school for 5, 6, 7, 10 years. It's the case of what's the newest person in your school. Do they understand everything that must occur as we go forward? And continuing on in this area, now we want to focus and give you some tools on how you measure it. I recommend that you work with at least 2 other people in your school. Could be as many as a total of 5 people on the team, you and 4 others, but somewhere between adding 2 and 4 to yourself to look at this. If it gets bigger than that, then the team loses its objectivity in terms of coming up and making things actionable quickly. If it's only 1 person, that's just 1 point of view. 3 is an optimum number, 5 works equally as well, to analyze your plans and show where you are relative to standards and best practices and help you improve your area. Now simply, there are going to be 3 things that we're going to want you to do. We're going to want you to have each one of you read your plan separately, then conduct some interviews and perform a site inspection, and we're going to give you some details on what's involved in that site inspection and what you're supposed to do as you read the plan. But let's go through reading the plan. Print it, have everybody have a print copy, take your yellow highlighter and have them highlight the sections that they have a question about or appear to be unclear. Put checks or take out that red pen that you used to grade the papers with and mark within the plan. And then after the 3 of you have done this separately, come together and talk about it. And you'll find that somebody highlighted an area that you didn't. Why did they highlight it? Why do they feel it's unclear? Why do they think it's inaccurate? And similarly, you'll have some areas that you can talk, and that discussion, the three of you hold, will go a long way toward helping to build a process of aligning your plans to standards and best practices. Well, wait a minute, why do you want to align to standards and best practices? One common theme that we find in any crisis is if you're explaining, you're losing. Let's hope that you never have a disaster or a crisis or an active shooter at your school. But after that event, parents are going to want to know why the plan didn't work. Why are these things not in place? And if you're explaining, you're losing. And always in those types of areas, we find that giving an excuse or saying, except for we were in pretty good shape, isn't what a parent wants to hear at that point in time. More importantly, none of us want to be the person who has to pick up the phone and say, your son or your daughter won't be coming home today. So the three of you review the plans, you've read them now, and as to think about that, what you would then do is to say, first, is our plan reviewed and updated annually? By the way, that's what standards and best practices require, is an annual review of your plan. Just going through this process meets one of the 45 components that you need to have to make sure that your plan is aligned to standards and best practices. You need to be able to explain how you identified the risk included in it. Did you just take another school who was nearby and say, well, our risk would be the same as theirs? Or did you specifically look at that? In addition to the natural disasters and exposures, did you look at the man-made ones? Did you look at the behavioral ones that come into play? Did you look at the cyber areas on it? We starting to see schools now becoming targets for cyber breach within those particular areas. So it's not, the question here is not did you identify, it's how did you identify those risks. Have you had a security assessment? Have you brought in a third party to look at your school and look at the locks, to look at the structures and what you have in place to deal with it, your policies and procedures? By the way, as an interim step, I'm sure if you check with your local police, they would be delighted to come and do a walkthrough with you to provide you some insights. And again, in any of these areas, if you need assistance, that's the role that Firestorm plays. So how do you monitor for each one of the threats and risks? We identified those with that second question up there, but now you need to spend as much time to say, all right, here's the risk that we have identified. What is it that we're going to monitor? How are we going to monitor it? And who on our school is responsible for that? Because if there's not a tool, if there's not a process for monitoring, and if there's not someone assigned to it, you're not going to do that, and then this risk will emerge as a full-blown crisis, and you will not have had any warning. How do your students, teachers, and parents know about your plan? Now, we're not going to take our entire plan and put it up on your website, particularly some of the security-related areas, because we're not trying to let someone, again, with ill intent understand those things. But there's a lot of your plan that you do want to have your people understand and carry it forward. Well, how do you communicate that? Is this something that you did at the start of the school year? Do you remind during the year? Do you test all of these elements that are associated with it? Those all become critical elements. And the way that the students, teachers, and parents know about the plan, each one of those will be different in how you carry it together. Look at the next one. Every component must be tested at least annually. Not just, hey, I did a test of the fire drill, which we would encourage you to do, and I know you do that many times during the year, but every component in your plan, how we communicate, how we make decisions, how we notify, all of those elements need to be tested annually to make sure they work. And test the way that we make the decisions becomes extremely critical in each one of these areas. So you don't have to test everything in every test, but you must at the end of the year have gone through and tested every component in going through your plan. You also, after every activation of your plan, whether that's an exercise where you're testing it, and that could be a tabletop or a simulation or a drill, or it could be an actual crisis that occurred, you want to conduct an after-action review. The term in the industry is a hot wash afterwards to identify what the lessons learned are. And we'll give you a tool in a few minutes that will help you with that also. So how should you measure? Get your team of 3 together, begin to answer these questions and carry forward. But we're going to go a little bit further. As you do the site assessment and walking through and going through the school, look at all the areas that you need to be looking at and going through from this standpoint. Looking at your building security, the access control. Are all your doors lockable? Are they locked during the school day? Do you have a surveillance system on those areas? Looking at the building exteriors, are there areas where someone can hide close to the school building? What kind of a key system and key control do you have in place? How do you monitor each one of these areas? And then look at sight lines. What can you see from this point? What can you see from that point? How does this flow? I also will tell you, when you do the site assessment, it's just not going to be one site assessment as you walk through. You need to do several. One, you need to do during the school day to see what it's like during your school day. Another, you need to do it at night. You run after-school activities and programs, and you have students on your campus overnight or for an after-school session. Also looking at it on the weekend. We're always concerned in a school environment when we look at doing a site assessment at what happens in the morning at drop-off, what happens in the afternoon at pickup. So we've identified about 5 different things that you need to do, 5 different times in doing this site assessment in order to understand it. Looking at your communications, your PA system, can it be heard outside the building? Notification systems and alerts, radios, cell phones. Do you get good reception everywhere on your school? The information technology and security systems that you have in place, the way you're monitoring social media for that intelligence network. And I'll give you some other insights on that before we finish today. Look at loading dock. Look at how people who are making deliveries to the school come in and access, and what are the controls around them. Lighting, and again, as the nighttime assessment will show you, the school in the campus and the layout looks completely different in the light. Look in the parking areas. We've also, you'll see another thing on signage. We saw a school where they ran a funding program, and they allowed parents to buy for the school year a parking space for their children. And so the large donations that were done, the wealthy students got great parking spots, and they got a plaque over their spot, a sign that said what their name was and where they were parking. Well, from a security standpoint, that's a disaster, because if I was trying to kidnap someone, I know exactly which car they were driving and where they were at a particular point in time. From a morale standpoint, that could also be equally a disaster within the school. So we look at the perimeter, the barriers, the controls, the security equipment, any particular breaches that you'd had before, looking at the personnel that you have, who's charged with security. Most of you do not have armed security on your school areas. Now, we talked about earlier in the slide before that you would be doing interviews, and doing interviews around what your policies and procedures are. You'd want to talk with some teachers, some of the staff. You would certainly want to talk with a few selected students to get their understanding of it. And I think what you're going to find is, in your school, there's going to be a continuum of knowledge. Some people will have a pretty good understanding, some maybe some, and some almost none. So if you find that in your interviews, that's another sign that your plan is not aligning with standards and best practice, because the communications and testing of your plans, those are 2 other components that you need to look at to make sure that your plans align. Traffic control is a particular additional area. Oh, and one other thought that's not even here to look at, and that's to make sure that you understand your reunification program, and that you have it documented, you have people signed, and they've been trained, and that you've done an exercise. If something happens at your campus and you have to then not have a normal dismissal, and you've got to match parents with students in a time of crisis or disaster that's occurring, what's your protocol? How are you going to do it? How do you validate that this parent has the right to pick up a child, remembering restraining orders and other issues? How do you link the students and parents together? When the parents arrive, how do you separate those that have children that have been injured or even worse, killed? You're not going to tell a parent in front of another the status of their child. That would create additional problems. If you haven't thought that through, here's another gap that you would have within your plans. So what do you measure against? Where and how does your plan address the program framework? That's that overarching document. It explains the structure and all the following support plans, whether it's communicable illness or incident response or behaviors of concern. Any of those things fit with a description and bringing that together. Clearly, the board has a responsibility to make sure that that framework exists. The risk assessment and identification of all the risks that are associated with it. School and workplace violence. The school is a workplace. Unfortunately, we get a call virtually every week from a school that's in a crisis. And it could range from a bullying episode or sexual assault or abuse to violent acts that can be concerned. You want to make sure that you have a behavior of concern program, a program that'll empowers you to do behavioral risk threat assessments. The goal here is always to intervene before the gun comes to school. You want to intervene at the point at which there are indicators, that there are warning signs that here's a student who has a problem. Maybe it's someone who's being bullied. Maybe it's someone who's contemplating suicide. Maybe someone has a substance problem or a domestic violence problem at home. Identifying those and assessing that and following through with doing the right investigation, the correct interviews, the tracking of it, having a school reentry plan established in advance. You want to do exactly the same thing every single time that there's a behavior of concern. The process is the same. The outcomes are different, but the process is the same. By the way, the person who was bullied we're as equally concerned about as the person who was the bullier. In this situation, we found that later there's a high tendency for those that have been bullied to seek violence as a solution to their problems. Also, the intelligence monitoring. How are you monitoring what's going on within the school and within those areas? Putting together the security program at your school. Again, the standards are that classrooms lock from the inside and remain locked during the school day. Human resources, that goes back to the background checks, and we've talked about this before, but to hit the high points. Clearly, you all do a background check before you hire a teacher or a staff member to work. Most of you are doing a good job of making sure you check the national felony database, and that's great. We certainly don't want to be letting a person with that background into your school. But are you checking the county courthouse for misdemeanors? What can happen is someone is arrested on a felony, but then plea bargains it down to a misdemeanor. Therefore, that person's name will not appear in the National Criminal Database. And so the only way to know that is to check it locally, and that's an important aspect for you to look at and include within it. Check with the company that does your background checks. It's not a significant additional charge to have that element added in. That'll also tell you if there's some substance abuse problems with a DUI, or if there are other issues associated with them, it's highly likely to come up. By the way, the standard, again, for background checks is that they're conducted annually. It's not a, when we hired them, we did a background check. You must repeat them annually if you want to be in alignment with standards and best practices, because it's the person was fine when we hired them, but developed a problem that was known to others and you don't look for it, you then are putting yourselves in a position to have an event that you don't want to have occur. If you also think under human resources that you've got defined policies about how we do terminations and how those are handled and who's responsible, and so that we minimize the points at which there could be an episode of concern. You'd be looking at addressing how your plan addresses security, the emergency response. Now, the good news is that we find that our emergency response in most cases in schools is pretty good. You've been doing a good job around fire and some of the other aspects of that. But it's an area to continually improve and to look forward, but that's a strength probably within your school. How do you notify? What's the notification system, whether it's the the broadcasting of an email or a text message or a call to get information out of the PA system over the school, or is it a bullhorn if the power is out so that you can at least communicate? And that ties directly into the next of crisis communications. For every risk, every threat, every vulnerability, have you identified the message maps that you would communicate to each one of your stakeholder groups? Because what you say to a student or a parent or a teacher can be different depending upon their age and their orientation and what the concerns are that you have associated with it. Thinking those things through will make a difference, because many times how you respond and how you communicate in the crisis can well create that second crisis that you're focused on. As we move from that, and we talked about going through the plan, and I want you to look at this as a process that the three of you that you appointed for your team will do as you go through, looking specifically at the plan as you read through it. Each component must be evaluated for its completeness. Just because you said it doesn't mean that it's complete and carried forward. And its completeness compared to the best practices. So if you're looking at the 45 of the components that are required for a plan today, the rating process that we would recommend that you use is to first of all say, is this documented here? If it is, that's good. That's great. This is the one time when getting a D on the test is really good. D stands for documented, not the other kind of a D that we see on our report cards. An I means, hey, we've got some of the stuff, but it's just incomplete. It's lacking something, and we'll talk about that in a minute. A U means it's just undocumented. We may have it, but it's not written down any place, and if it's not written down any place, you haven't trained on it, you haven't tested on it, and that's a little scary, so we want to go in and fill that gap. An R is you looked at it and you go, you know, it's just not what we need here. It's wrong. We need to revise it. And NA could be not applicable. It doesn't really apply to our school. Let's go a little bit more under the cover associated with these letters. Documented. Components of the plan are receiving this rating are in alignment with best practices. The procedures are actionable. Now again, what that means is it tells us not what to do, but how to do it. The content is comprehensive and provides the stakeholders, whoever's using this plan, is the teacher using this, is the administration using it, are the students using it, with a clear understanding of what their role is and their responsibilities within the plans. The plans are actionable and follow best practices. Now, one of the best practices that we would think of in the emergency response area is the standard response protocol. And that's the best way to make sure that you've aligned to the all hazards emergency response area. When we talk about standard protocol, we're thinking about the protocol that was developed by the I Love You guys. It's now in, it says 5,000 schools. I think they're closer to 10,000 schools that are following it. And it's the terms lockout, lockdown, evacuate, or shelter. By the way, anytime you're using any terms other than that, you run the risk of confusion and people not understanding it. Sometimes we've seen people go, well, that's a code yellow, that's a code green. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't sound clear. You want to have terms that there can be no confusion. We've also seen teams use sports teams. If they're the Colts, they could go Stampede. Well, that's a different kind of a thought, and it's unclear. You also want to coordinate with your local authorities on what your codes are and how you use them and communicate. Remember the message maps that I talked about. So if you have this incident, here's the message we're going to send, and here's what action that we expect to have carried forward as you look at it. Go to the I Love You guys, look at that. If you haven't, it'll be a great source of some additional information that would certainly help you in that particular area. An incomplete is just like when you're grading a test. It's incomplete. They didn't go through in it. There's some further enhancement or detail. Maybe it says the what, but it doesn't tell you the how associated with it. There is some documentation, but if we can get it up to that next level, it'll be faster, easier to execute. It'll be safer, and most importantly, it's going to be clear, because confusion in a crisis is exactly what we want to evolve. Anytime you think about that, there are two words that I'd like to have in the back of your mind, and that's time and access. Those are what we're trying to do. We're trying to buy time, if there's a problem here and we're waiting for first responders, how do we lengthen that window that we have? We're trying to shorten it in terms of getting our people to safety. Access is access to information, access to the school, and sometimes we're trying to keep bad things out, and other times we're trying to get access to critical things that we need. Undocumented means that it's just not in our plan. Yeah, we understand it's one of the components, but we haven't done it that way, and so we would recommend that you come back and complete and build that. And then finally, you're going to find some areas that just needing revision. We just finished the analysis of a plan and aligning it to a set of best practices that they had chosen, and they had 171 data points identified in it. Of the 171, 28 needed to be revised. They were, in fact, just wrong. 36 were undocumented. They hadn't done, and the rest they had documented. They were in pretty good shape associated with it. So as you look at those areas, you can find an opportunity to make a difference as you go forward. So now what we've done is talked about creating a team of 3 to 5 people. As you read through your plans, and then after each one of you reads individually, coming together, and then I'd do a big spreadsheet. I'd lay this out. Here's the component. Is that documented or is it incomplete? Is it undocumented, or do we need to revise associated with it? And then each one of you goes through, do it together as a team after you've done the individual review. Then I think that'll give you a good handle on your plan. If you don't want to do that individually in-house and you would like us to do it for you, clearly that's something that we can do. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is to do the site assessment that we just talked about, and doing it during the day, at night, on the weekend, doing it at pickup, and doing it at drop-off. You'll learn different things in each one of those, as well as doing the interviews throughout and placing it. This is how you're going to know, is it going to happen here? Are we ready? Do our plans align to standards and best practices? This is part of our conversion of you into an internal auditor, to have that ability to be able to be sure in coming together. Now, a hot wash was a term we introduced on an earlier slide, and it means taking a look at what you did in that test exercise or in an actual crisis. What worked well, what didn't work well, so that you can go back and have the lessons learned and then improve it. As we talk about preparedness in schools, it's a continuous improvement process. Even the new ISO standards that are out for business around quality have gone back and added risk within it. How do we know that our school is ready and prepared for whatever we might face? That's what this hot wash will do for you. Here are the actions that you need to take. And again, this team of 3 or 5 might be the team that would review and evaluate the event. How did we do? What feedback did we receive from those that were involved? In particular, notice the third. Note issues of command, control, coordination, and communications. Those 4 C's will give you a good insight into how well your school was able to function at a critical time or in this exercise. Have every one of the departments share with what they were doing. Department in your case could be the office area, or it could be the lower school or the upper school. It could be any of the coaching aspects associated with it and coming together. Look at what you spent. What's the return here? Have we been wasting money in a particular area? Are there things that we need? Like we don't have a PA system, or we don't have a bullhorn that could be used if the PA system is in fact not doing as you're carrying forward. Look then at the suggestions for improvement into your plans. Do you need to do testing of some component of it? Maybe we only have to test the notification aspect. Maybe that's where the problem occurred. Or how we handled the identification of where everyone is and getting a good student count after an event that occurred, or the reunification aspects of it. Provide feedback to all of those that are involved, and then write a summary. And that report that you will write up on the exercise or on the crisis should go to your board, because they have a governance and fiduciary responsibility to make sure that all those elements are in place. So simply follow the Predict, Plan, Perform. Understanding what the vulnerabilities and threats are. What are their impacts? How do you monitor? What are the triggers? Who's responsible for this? What tools do they have to do those things? The plans cover the emergency areas that we've talked about, the crisis management, the behavioral risk threat assessments, the communicable illness, the physical security, the cyber security. There's so many areas that you need to have in place. And then finally, the performing, how you've trained, how you've tested it, the supplies that you need to have in place, the monitoring, and then finally, the crisis management. Now, in all of this, we're just asking you to look at what you've got on your plate. Look at what's there. Look at what's working well. Look at where it's not. Again, remember that idea of going to your newest person, letting them look at it, and if it's not clear to them, it's not clear to you. We want people to know, not have to think. If something's occurring, we want to make sure that we're optimizing and doing that action. The intelligence network, and we'll talk about that many more times during this year, and we already have, you've got to know what's going on. You've got to be listening to the conversations that are occurring, and that gives you situational awareness, looking at the streams, the phrases, the words that are being used. Those become cues for you, or tells, or warning signs, or indicators. Pick the choice of word that you would like to let you know there's something you need to then look closer at. And that there are different tools for listening and looking. And when we're doing the looking, we're looking at a person of interest or a particular event. For that person of interest, what's their sphere of influence? Who are they talking to? What are they talking about? And measuring that so that you can intervene before the decision is made to bring the gun to school, or to contemplate suicide, or to take those next steps as we carry forward. So, do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? And the answer has to be yes. Can you afford not to know? The answer is, you're right, I got to know, because I don't want to learn about it as the event is occurring. I want to know about it before to intervene so that hopefully we can prevent it, or at the very least that we can mitigate the impacts that it'll have on our school family, on our school community. If you'd like to learn more about how to do that internal analysis of your plans or to align your plans to best practices, let us know. We'll be glad to help. We can help you create your own intelligence network or to schedule some crisis coach training. And again, all the RenWeb schools will have a great opportunity at the user meeting in July in San Antonio to go through some extensive crisis coach training and a crisis coach boot camp to go through and look at all of these elements in great detail. If you'd like an assessment of your plan and where it is relative to standards and best practices, the cost of that's been borne by RenWeb and won't cost your school anything. It's a $2,500 value, and that might be a good place to start. You can go to the Firestorm website, request it, mention RenWeb, and the cost is waived. So our thanks to RenWeb. And Shannon, hopefully you were able to join us here today. I didn't get to hear you speak, and next time we hopefully will have you on, or if you're here and don't have your mute button punched and you want to make an observation at the end, this is a good time. And not hearing that, I will tell you that if you'd like more information for Firestorm, go to firestorm.com or send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com or call us at 800-321-2219. Thank you for all that you do in your school every day. Thank you for what you're doing to make our children safe every day. We would like to help, and we want you to not have to deal with the aftermath of one of these events. Making sure that your school aligns your plans to standards and best practices is critical. Unfortunately, we get calls every week from schools in crisis. Over the last 2 weeks, we've worked with 2 RenWeb schools that have found themselves in crisis that they hadn't expected. Knowing what to do is critical. You can begin the process by building your own team and looking at the components and the dimensions that we talked about. If you need any assistance, reach out to us. I'm glad that spring's here. I think you probably are too. Tired of winter, looking forward to this plan. Why not set a goal to make sure that you review your plans now, that you make changes and update them over the summer so that when our children come back to school in the fall, we're ready and you're prepared. Have a great day, everyone, and I look forward to speaking with you next month and meeting you in San Antonio in July. Goodbye.